The glow of the monitor illuminated Elijah's face, casting sharp shadows that accentuated his tense features. His fingers gripped the keyboard, moving faster than his mind could process what he was doing. His heart pounded in his chest, as if warning him that he was about to cross a line he could never return from. Lines of code scrolled endlessly across the screen, revealing layers of encrypted files buried deep within the corporate servers of Whitmore Industries. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, bypassing firewalls, masking his digital footprint, making sure no one could trace this back to him. But now that he was here, staring at the undeniable truth unfolding before his eyes, he felt paralyzed. His breath hitched as a single document popped up on the screen. A birth certificate, sealed away under layers of security, hidden from the world. His name was there. Elijah Carter. But beneath it, in faded text, was a name that changed everything. Father, Randall Whitmore. His hands tightened into fists as he leaned closer, his sharp brown eyes scanning every detail, looking for any sign of deception. His whole life, he had fought against the system that told him he wasn't enough, that his intelligence, his ambition, his very existence as a black man in this world meant he had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. And yet, all this time, the man who had built an empire on power and privilege had been his father. The same man who had never once looked for him. A slow, burning rage coiled inside him, tightening like a vice around his ribs. This wasn't just some clerical error. This wasn't a mistake. This was a deliberate erasure. He dug deeper, pulling up legal documents, medical records, financial statements, anything that could explain why his mother had raised him alone in the struggling neighborhoods of Atlanta while his so-called father and half-brother, Daniel Whitmore, had lived in luxury. His mother had always been secretive about the past, dodging his questions with soft smiles and vague reassurances, but now the truth was staring him in the face. Randall Whitmore had covered it up, paid to keep it buried, ensured that no one would ever know that his firstborn son was a black child from a woman he had discarded. He was supposed to be part of that world. But instead, he had been cast aside like an inconvenience. Elijah exhaled sharply, forcing himself to think. He had always known he was different, always felt like he carried something inside him that couldn't be explained. His height, his strong, defined features, the deep, rich tone of his skin, all things that made him stand out, made people either admire or fear him. And now he knew why. He was born from power but denied his place in it. That ends tonight. His mind raced with possibilities, but one thing was clear, he wasn't walking away from this. He copied the files, encrypted them, and sent them to a hidden drive. If Randall Whitmore thought he could erase him from history, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. A sound outside his apartment made him freeze. A soft creak. The shift of weight against the wooden floor in the hallway. He wasn't alone. His pulse spiked as he shut down the screen, grabbed his phone, and reached for the drawer where he kept his knife. He moved silently, every muscle in his body coiled like a predator ready to strike. He had grown up knowing danger, had learned early that the world wouldn't protect him. He had learned to fight. And if someone thought they could stop him before he uncovered the full truth, they were in for a brutal awakening. Elijah stood still, listening, his sharp instincts kicking in. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, a shadow moved beneath the door. They knew. Someone had followed his trail. His chest rose and fell in steady control, but inside, his blood burned. If they had come to scare him, they had picked the wrong man. The moment he stepped into the fire, he had already decided there was no turning back. Elijah stood in the cold, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles ached, every muscle in his body coiled with tension as he stared at the man who should have been his brother, the man who had lived his entire life in luxury while Elijah had fought for every scrap of respect, for every ounce of dignity, for the right to exist in a world that had never been meant for him. Daniel Whitmore stood before him, impeccably dressed, exuding the quiet arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything, his sharp jaw clenched, his piercing eyes scanning Elijah as if he were an unwanted problem to be dealt with rather than a brother demanding answers. "So this is it?" Elijah's voice was low, steady, but every syllable carried the weight of years of resentment, betrayal, fury simmering beneath the surface. "You had everything. The name. The legacy. The father. And I had nothing. And you knew. Daniel scoffed, arms crossing over his chest as he cut him off with a smirk so infuriating it made Elijah's blood boil. I knew, he repeated, shaking his head with disbelief, his voice laced with condescension. You think I knew about you? You think I spent my whole life knowing there was some long-lost brother out there? Trust me, if I had, I wouldn't have wasted a second caring. The words hit like a slap, but Elijah had come prepared for this. He had spent years hardening himself, knowing that the moment he confronted the Whitmores, he wouldn't be welcomed with open arms. But the sheer indifference in Daniel's tone was more infuriating than outright rejection. He erased me, Elijah hissed, stepping forward, his breath shallow with rage. He made sure no one would ever know I existed. But your life was perfect, wasn't it? No questions, no doubts, just a father who handed you everything while I had to fight for every damn thing in my life. Daniel's expression flickered, but it wasn't guilt, just irritation, impatience, a man who didn't like being dragged into problems that weren't his own. You don't get it, he said flatly, and I don't expect you to. You think having his name meant I had it easy? That I just sat back and collected the rewards? He gestured around, to the expensive penthouse, the life of power and prestige. This came with a price. You weren't the only one who had to prove himself. You weren't the only one who had to earn his place. Elijah let out a harsh laugh, bitterness dripping from every word. Earn? You want to talk to me about earning? You had every door open for you while I had to kick them down just to be noticed. Don't stand there and act like you fought for any of this the way I did. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't back down, stepping closer, lowering his voice into something sharper, deadlier. And what exactly do you want from me? An apology? A place at the table? I don't owe you anything. My father made his choice. Maybe that's what you should be asking yourself, why he left you behind. That hit deeper than Elijah wanted to admit, but he refused to let Daniel see it, refused to let him have the satisfaction. He left me behind because he was a coward, Elijah snapped. Because he knew I was proof of everything he wanted to pretend never happened. And you, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. You're just another piece of his empire, his perfect son, pretending like none of this touches you. For the first time, Daniel faltered, just a flicker of something in his gaze, some realization that maybe, just maybe, things weren't as simple as he wanted them to be. But then he exhaled sharply, stepping back, shaking his head like he was done with this conversation. This isn't my fight, he muttered. I have no reason to risk everything for a brother I never knew. Elijah stared at him, chest rising and falling with controlled rage. Then stay out of my way, he said, voice cold as steel. Because I'm not stopping until everyone knows exactly who I am. A sound behind them made Elijah turn. Naomi stood there, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but the warning in her eyes was clear. You don't know what you're up against, Elijah, she said quietly. Randall doesn't forgive. And he doesn't lose. But Elijah simply squared his shoulders, the fire in his chest burning hotter than ever. Neither do I. Elijah sat across from his mother, their determination a silent force between them, both knowing that what they were about to do would shake the very foundations of the Whitmore empire, but neither willing to back down, not now, not after all the lies, the betrayals, the years spent in the shadows while Randall Whitmore built his fortune on the backs of those he considered disposable. Naomi's voice was steady, her eyes sharp as she laid out the names, the dates, the reports they had gathered, documents that proved beyond any doubt that Whitmore Industries had been burying their environmental crimes for decades, that their factories had poisoned rivers, that their waste had devastated communities, that people had suffered, had lost their homes, their health, their lives, all while Randall sat in his glass tower, untouchable, untarnished, protected by his power and the system he had spent years corrupting. We have enough, Naomi said, pushing the files toward Elijah, her fingers trembling just slightly, though her resolve never wavered. But it won't be enough unless people are willing to speak. Elijah exhaled, his mind racing, already calculating the risks, already preparing for the war that was about to begin. He had spent years exposing corruption, tearing down the powerful who thought they could hide behind money and influence, but this was different. This wasn't just another corporation, another scandal waiting to be uncovered. This was personal. "Then we find them," he said, gripping the edge of the table, the fire in his chest burning hotter than ever. "We find the people who suffered because of him, the ones he thought he silenced. We give them a voice." And they did. They reached out to former employees, to families who had lost everything to the reckless greed of Whitmore Industries, to whistleblowers who had once tried to stand up but had been crushed under the weight of the machine. Some were too afraid to talk, their fear a testament to the reach of Randall's power, but others were ready. A former engineer who had seen safety regulations ignored until an entire community was left without clean water. A scientist who had been fired for refusing to falsify reports. A worker whose lungs had been scarred by toxic fumes, who had lost his health, his family, his future, all because Whitmore Industries had deemed his life less important than profit. They recorded testimonies, gathered documents, built a case so airtight not even Randall's money could make it disappear. But Randall had never been the kind of man to wait for an attack. He struck first. The first blow came swiftly, so calculated it was almost surgical. Elijah arrived at work to find his office locked, his belongings boxed, his access revoked without warning. Security escorted him out like a criminal, and within hours, headlines flooded the media, allegations of misconduct, whispers of fraud, a carefully crafted smear campaign designed to dismantle everything he had built. His emails were leaked, doctored messages making it appear as though he had fabricated stories in the past, manipulating sources for personal gain. Sponsors pulled out, his credibility shattered overnight. And it didn't stop there. His allies began to disappear, one by one. Phone numbers disconnected, doors slammed in his face, messages left unread, as if they had never existed, as if the moment they had dared to stand against Whitmore, they had been erased from the world. Naomi was followed, their home vandalized, threats scrawled across their front door in thick black paint, a silent promise that this fight would cost them everything. But Elijah refused to break. He fought back, countered every accusation, dug deeper, pushed harder, determined to bring the truth to light no matter the cost. And then, just when it seemed as though Randall had succeeded in crushing every last hope they had, an email arrived. No sender, no subject, just a single attachment. A video. Shaky footage, grainy but clear enough to see the men in suits standing over a body, to hear their voices murmuring orders, to catch the unmistakable smirk of Randall Whitmore himself as he turned away. A cover-up. A death buried under paperwork and bribes. Proof of something far worse than they had ever imagined. Elijah stared at the screen, heart pounding, pulse racing, knowing that this was the weapon he needed. But the real question was, who had sent it? Elijah stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, his pulse hammering in his ears as he scrolled through the files, each one a revelation more damning than the last, a labyrinth of corruption meticulously hidden behind layers of encrypted data, offshore accounts, shell corporations, all leading back to one man, Randall Whitmore. He had expected to find environmental violations, financial fraud, maybe even illegal lobbying, but this was something else entirely, something deeper, darker, a history of bribes, blackmail, disappearances, names of people who had stood in his father's way and had simply ceased to exist. His breath caught in his throat as he opened a file marked with nothing but a date, 20 years ago, the year his mother had left, the year she had taken him and vanished. He clicked it open, eyes scanning the lines of transactions, payouts, sealed settlements, the truth unraveling in front of him with every line he read. His mother hadn't just escaped Randall, she had survived him. But before he could process the weight of what he had uncovered, his phone buzzed, the number unknown, the message brief, stop. Or she dies. A single image attached, a live feed, his mother's face, eyes wide with fear, hands bound, a figure standing just out of frame, the shadow of power pressing down on her like a vice. Ice shot through his veins, his vision tunneling, his hands gripping the desk so hard his knuckles went white. Randall had anticipated this. He had always been one step ahead. Elijah had been so focused on exposing the empire that he had forgotten the simplest rule in the game. Power doesn't fall without blood, and the first blood spilled is always personal. His fingers trembled as he reached for his laptop, the files still open, the evidence within his grasp, the power to destroy his father's legacy at his fingertips, but at what cost? Across the city, Daniel sat in the private office Randall had summoned him to, the heavy scent of aged whiskey and leather filling the room, his father's gaze piercing through him like a blade. "I assume you've heard," Randall said, swirling his drink, voice calm, measured, as if he were discussing nothing more than stock prices and board meetings, as if he hadn't just ordered the abduction of a woman, as if he hadn't built his fortune on the destruction of lives. "Your brother has always been reckless. Emotional. But you're smarter than that, aren't you, Daniel?" A folder slid across the table, thick, weighty, filled with everything Daniel already knew but had tried to ignore. The truth about Elijah, about the empire he was set to inherit, about the deal his father was offering him now. "He's a threat," Randall continued, leaning forward, his voice a serpent's whisper. "A man like you doesn't need to share power with a bastard who thinks he can burn down everything we built. But I'm a reasonable man. I'm offering you a choice." The words hung heavy in the air as Randall leaned back, smiling, knowing he had already won. "Help me get rid of Elijah, and the company is yours. Every last piece of it." Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind a battlefield of loyalty and ambition, of blood and legacy, of a father who had never truly loved him but had always expected obedience, and a brother he had only just met, a man he was supposed to despise, but who had somehow forced him to question everything. He could walk away, take the deal, claim the throne his father had been grooming him for, let Elijah crumble under the weight of his own rebellion. Or he could do something else. Something dangerous. Something that neither his father nor his brother would ever see coming. His fingers traced the edge of the folder, his pulse steady, his decision made. He looked up at Randall, his expression unreadable, his voice smooth. "I'll handle it." But as he walked out of the office, the weight of the choice settling in his chest, one thing remained certain. Nobody, not his father, not his brother, not even himself, would see what was coming next. Daniel sat in his car, fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, the city lights bleeding through the windshield as the truth sank in, heavy and inescapable, his father's words still echoing in his mind like the remnants of a bad dream, offering him power in exchange for betrayal, dangling the legacy of Whitmore Industries like a poisoned crown. He had spent his entire life believing he was the rightful heir, the chosen one, the son who would carry on the family empire, but now, as the weight of what he had agreed to settled on his chest, suffocating and unbearable, he felt something crack deep inside him, something that had been rigid and unquestioning for too long. His father had been playing him from the start, molding him, controlling him, keeping him in a gilded cage while feeding him the illusion of autonomy, and he had swallowed it whole, blind to the strings pulling him in every direction, but not anymore. He needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to him. Catherine Whitmore had spent decades perfecting the art of composure, her life a carefully constructed performance of poise and privilege, but as Daniel stepped into her suite, the mask cracked just slightly, a flicker of something, guilt, regret, maybe even fear, flashing behind her carefully lined eyes before she composed herself once more, offering him a seat, pouring herself a drink, as if this were nothing more than an ordinary visit from her son. "You knew," Daniel said, his voice flat, the accusation laced with something raw. "You knew about Elijah all this time, and you never said a word." She didn't deny it. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she exhaled slowly, eyes distant, voice eerily calm as she spoke the words he already knew were true. "I did what I had to do." The weight of it pressed down on him, the betrayal layered within her silence, a mother who had chosen survival over truth, who had accepted a lie because it was easier than the war that would have followed the truth. "I couldn't save him," she admitted, voice lower now, almost a whisper. "I couldn't save either of you." Across the city, Elijah was piecing together the final puzzle, his fingers trembling as he scrolled through the encrypted files, his heart hammering as the full scope of the horror unraveled before him, a network of exploitation stretching across continents. The company's wealth built not just on corruption and fraud but on something far worse, forced labor camps hidden under the guise of offshore mining operations, entire villages turned into factories of suffering, men, women, and children. Reduced to numbers on a ledger, all under Randall Whitmore's control. His stomach churned as he recognized a familiar name buried deep in the records, a woman who had once dared to speak the truth before being erased from history. His mother. The realization hit like a fist to the gut. She had known, she had tried to expose it, and she had paid the price. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was justice. This was war. The knock on his door was unexpected, but when he opened it, there stood Daniel, his expression unreadable, his presence an anomaly in a war where sides had already been drawn, and for a long moment, neither spoke, the silence between them thick with everything unsaid, years of absence, resentment, distrust, and now, something else, something unfamiliar. "We need to talk," Daniel finally said, stepping inside, his movements tense, uncertain, a man caught between two worlds, between loyalty and conscience, between the father who had shaped him and the brother he had never known. Elijah watched him, searching for deception, but for the first time, he saw something different in Daniel's eyes. Doubt, hesitation, maybe even guilt. "I found something," Elijah said instead, turning the laptop toward him, the damning evidence lighting up the screen, proof of crimes too monstrous to ignore. Daniel's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides, and then, slowly, he nodded. For the first time, they were no longer enemies. They were something else. They were allies. The headlines spread like wildfire, bold accusations flashing across every screen, every newspaper, every news ticker painting Elijah as the villain, branding him a corporate saboteur, a radical extremist, a man so desperate for revenge that he was willing to fabricate evidence against a respectable, time-honored institution like Whitmore Industries, a company that had built America, a company that had provided thousands of jobs, a company that, if you believed the carefully curated reports, was now under attack by a bitter, vengeful fraud. Every channel ran the same footage, doctored images, falsified financial records, grainy security footage taken out of context, all meticulously crafted to turn the public against him, to make him the enemy. But the worst part wasn't the accusations, wasn't even the way his reputation crumbled in real time, it was the silence on the other end of the phone, the calls that went unanswered, the realization sinking in with a cold finality that his mother was gone. Elijah's grip tightened around the burner phone in his hand, his breath coming fast and shallow as he tried again, dialing the number he had called a dozen times already, each ring stretching unbearably long before cutting to the same lifeless voicemail, his mother's voice, soft, recorded before she vanished into nothing. Panic clawed at the edges of his mind, but he forced it down, pushed it back, turned it into fuel, into something sharp, something lethal, because this wasn't just an attack on him anymore. This was personal, this was a message, a warning carved into reality with ruthless precision. Randall Whitmore didn't just want to destroy him. He wanted to erase him. Across the city, Daniel sat in the dim glow of his office, hands steepled beneath his chin, eyes locked on the news coverage looping endlessly on the screen, a carefully constructed narrative turning his half-brother into a fugitive, his father's voice playing over the broadcast, smooth, controlled, oozing false sincerity as he condemned Elijah's so-called betrayal, painting him as a dangerous force that needed to be dealt with swiftly, lawfully, definitively. The words were crafted to sound reasonable, to sound measured, but Daniel knew exactly what they meant. Elijah was being hunted, and if he didn't disappear on his own, someone would make sure he did. His stomach twisted, bow rising in his throat as the weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating, unbearable. He could walk away. He could let this play out, distance himself from it, protect his own life, his own future. Or he could do the unthinkable. He could choose a side. Elijah paced the cramped motel room, his pulse a violent drumbeat in his ears as he scrolled through the messages flooding his inbox, threats, warnings, demands for him to surrender, to turn himself in, to face justice. But there was no justice here, only power, only control, and he was losing ground by the second. He had to find his mother. He had to figure out a way to fight back, to counter the lies before they became truth, before the world swallowed them whole and left nothing behind but a footnote in history. But how? How do you fight a system that owns the narrative, that controls every channel, every story, every piece of information? The answer hit him like a freight train. You don't fight it alone. The knock on the door was quiet but deliberate, and Elijah's muscles coiled, his hand hovering over the gun resting on the bedside table as he moved cautiously toward the peephole, his heart hammering at the sight of the figure standing in the dimly lit hallway. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't seen this coming. But there, standing outside his door, was the last person he thought would ever come looking for him. Daniel. And he wasn't alone. Behind him, a woman stepped forward, her face partially obscured by the shadows, but Elijah recognized her instantly, Lena Carter, a name that had been whispered in boardrooms and political circles, a woman with enough leverage and connections to tear down empires. "You want to survive this?" she said, voice low, unwavering. "Then it's time to play smarter." For the first time in days, Elijah allowed himself to breathe. Maybe, just maybe, they still had a chance. The air in the abandoned office was thick with tension, the weight of desperation pressing down on Elijah as he studied the man across from him, a former corporate lawyer with the kind of weary, haunted look that only came from years of compromise, from selling pieces of his soul in exchange for power, from knowing too much and saying too little. His name was Malcolm Hayes, once one of Randall Whitmore's most trusted legal enforcers, the architect behind 1,000 silenced lawsuits, the man who had buried evidence so deep it was never meant to see daylight again. But now, standing here, stripped of his designer suits, his prestige, his power, Malcolm was a man with nothing left to lose, and that made him dangerous. "I know where the bodies are buried," he said, voice rough, the bitterness cutting through every syllable. "And I know how to dig them up." Elijah listened, arms crossed, pulse hammering as Malcolm laid it out. There was a backdoor into the company's encrypted database, an oversight left behind when they upgraded their security systems. It was buried deep, protected by layers of firewalls, but it was there, and with the right access, they could pull everything: financial records, offshore accounts, internal communications, evidence that would be undeniable, indisputable, the kind that wouldn't just ruin Randall Whitmore, it would annihilate him. But they had to act fast. The system was set to be patched within the next 48 hours, and once it was, their only chance would be gone. Daniel stood near the window, silent, watching the city stretch out beneath them, the flickering neon lights reflecting in his unreadable eyes. Elijah could feel the weight of his hesitation, the conflict tearing at him, the struggle between loyalty and justice, between self-preservation and something bigger. But there was no time for doubt. Not now. Not when they were this close. "What do we need?" Elijah finally asked, and Malcolm's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Access," he said. "And that's where you come in." The plan was reckless, but it was their only shot. Daniel would use his position to get them inside the corporate network, to mask their digital footprint while Malcolm extracted the files, while Elijah prepared the final blow. It was happening. It was real. But then the phone rang. And everything stopped. Elijah knew before he answered, before he heard the voice on the other end, low and steady, laced with the kind of control that only came from a man who held all the cards. "Randall Whitmore." "Let's make this simple," he said, his tone almost casual, almost bored. "You turn yourself in. Publicly. You admit to everything. You say you lied. You take the fall." Elijah's grip tightened around the phone, the edges of his vision blurring. "And if I don't?" Silence. Then your mother disappears forever." The line went dead. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in, the weight of it pressing down on him, suffocating. He looked at Daniel. He looked at Malcolm. He thought about the files, about the truth, about justice. And he thought about his mother. There was no right choice. Only the one he could live with. Daniel stood before the courtroom, the weight of his decision pressing against his chest like an iron vice, his mind racing with the consequences of what he was about to do. The cameras flashed, the whispers spread like wildfire, and the eyes of the world turned toward the man who once stood as the heir to Randall Whitmore's empire. But today he was not a Whitmore. He was a witness, a traitor in his father's eyes, the final nail in the coffin of a dynasty built on corruption and silence. His voice was steady as he took the stand, every word deliberate, every confession stripping away the illusion that had been carefully crafted over decades. He spoke of bribery, of backdoor deals, of silenced whistleblowers and bodies buried under mountains of forged contracts. The prosecution pounced on every detail, their case solidified by the very man who had once been groomed to inherit it all. There was no turning back now. Meanwhile, Elijah sat in a dimly lit room, fingers poised over the keyboard, Malcolm standing behind him with bated breath. The encrypted files blinked on the screen, a digital treasure trove of Randall Whitmore's greatest sins: financial fraud, environmental destruction, illegal labor. Elijah had spent years dreaming of this moment, the chance to expose the man who had erased him, who had stolen his future, who had played God with lives like they were disposable. One click. That was all it took. The files uploaded to every major news outlet, whistleblower platform, and social media feed across the globe. Within minutes, the internet exploded. Headlines screamed the downfall of a corporate titan, stock prices plummeted in real time, and the Whitmore empire cracked at the foundations. Randall knew it was over before the phone even rang. His lawyers had already fled, his investors pulling out like rats escaping a sinking ship. He stood in his office, watching the skyline, the city he had once ruled now turning against him. The sound of approaching footsteps made him turn, and he was met with the cold stares of his sons. Daniel, his golden boy, his legacy, the son he had shaped in his own image, now looking at him with nothing but contempt. And Elijah, the shadow he had tried to erase, standing tall, unbroken, the living proof of his greatest failure. "You've both made a mistake," Randall said, his voice measured, but the flicker of desperation betrayed him. "You think this is victory? It's not. It's an opportunity." He stepped forward, spreading his hands like a king offering his crown. "Take it. The company. The assets. The name. Everything I built, it's yours. The world only cares about the scandal for a moment. Then they forget. You boys? You could rebuild. You could be bigger than I ever was." Silence hung between them. Daniel's jaw clenched, Elijah's fists tightened. This was it. The final temptation. The last offer from a dying king. "No," Elijah said, his voice firm, unwavering. "We're not you." Daniel exhaled, his decision solidified in that moment. "This ends here." Randall's expression barely flickered, but Elijah saw it. The fear, the realization, the moment he knew there was no coming back from this. The man who once held all the power was now powerless, standing before the sons who had stripped him of his throne. Security burst in, agents of the law following close behind. Randall Whitmore, the untouchable, was finally in chains. The world watched as the empire he had built crumbled at his feet. But for Elijah and Daniel, this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. Naomi stepped out of the dark, sterile confines of captivity, the air outside thick with the weight of a freedom that no longer felt like victory. She had fought, endured, survived, but the scars on her soul ran deeper than any physical wound. The system had never been built to protect people like her, and she knew it now more than ever. Elijah wrapped his arms around her, feeling the fragile strength in her frame, the quiet rage simmering beneath her silence. She had believed in justice once, believed that truth could dismantle empires, but now she knew better. Justice was a game played by men in power, and her son was about to find out just how rigged it was. Randall Whitmore sat in his cell, calm, composed, untouched by the chaos he had created. He was no fool. He had built his empire on the backs of men who knew how to bend the rules, men who knew how to turn chains into keys. His lawyers had already set the wheels in motion, planting seeds of doubt in the prosecution's case, spinning narratives of corporate sabotage and false accusations. The trial would be a spectacle, but if played right, he would walk free. Money had a way of making the truth bend, and Randall had more than enough to twist reality to his will. Elijah saw it happening in real time, the media already shifting, stories cropping up that painted Randall as the victim of a corporate coup, old allegations against Elijah resurfacing, whispers of corruption muddying the waters. He had done everything right, exposed the lies, torn down the walls, and yet the system was already rebuilding them brick by brick. His mother's hollow gaze haunted him. He had promised her justice, promised that the man who stole her life would pay, but what if justice didn't exist? What if the world was just a machine designed to protect men like Randall Whitmore? Then came the offer. Discreet, untraceable, but undeniable. A message delivered through an old channel, a deal whispered through the cracks of a crumbling empire. Take the money. Walk away. Disappear. Randall had already set aside an account, a number so large it could erase every problem, every worry. Elijah could leave the fight behind, take his mother far away, build a new life where no one could touch them. He had fought long enough, suffered long enough. Was this really a battle worth dying for? Daniel watched his brother wrestle with the choice, saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the way his fingers twitched with the weight of a decision no man should ever have to make. He knew what Randall was doing, knew exactly how this game was played. His father had spent a lifetime teaching him how to manipulate weakness, how to find the cracks in a man's armor and slip the knife between them. Elijah was at his breaking point, and Randall knew it. That's when Daniel made his choice. He walked into the courtroom, past the press, past the security, past the fear that had kept him silent for so long. He had spent his life running from the truth, burying himself in privilege and comfort, pretending he was nothing like the man who raised him. But that was a lie. He was his father's son, forged in the same fire, taught the same ruthless lessons. And for the first time, he used it against him. The room fell silent as Daniel took the stand, the final witness in a case that was slipping through the cracks. He looked his father in the eye and burned the last bridge between them. He didn't just testify, he buried him. He revealed details no one else knew, accounts, transactions, conversations behind locked doors, confessions that could only come from someone inside. He tore down the last defense Randall had, stripped him of every legal shield, every lifeline. It wasn't just betrayal. It was execution. Randall Whitmore, the man who had always been untouchable, watched as his fate was sealed, not by his enemies, but by his own blood. The court erupted, the case turned, and for the first time, Elijah saw something close to justice take shape. But at what cost? Randall Whitmore listens to the verdict without a single emotion on his face, as if it doesn't concern him, as if he is still in control of the situation even when the judge utters two words that change everything: life imprisonment. The courtroom erupts with noise, some people applaud, others protest, but he remains motionless, his cold gaze unchanged, as if he knows something the rest of them don't. Elijah watches him, trying to process that this is the end, but deep inside he already feels that it isn't. Randall's shadow will linger, his connections, his system, his people won't disappear overnight. He might rot in prison, but his influence won't dissolve so easily. Daniel doesn't stay for the press conference, doesn't wait for the final formalities, he simply walks away. There was a time when he was proud of his last name, believed it meant something, that the name Whitmore was strength, status, power, but now it feels like shackles, chains binding him to a past he wants to erase. He is no longer an heir, no longer the continuation of the family dynasty, just a man who made a choice. He removes his last name from documents, steps down from the board of directors, sells his share in the company, crosses himself out of the family tree. He starts over, without privilege, without an inheritance, without a past, and for the first time in his life, he feels like he can breathe. Elijah stands in front of the ruined Whitmore Corporation building, looking at the shattered windows, the scattered debris, the remnants of what was once an unshakable empire. He has won. He has brought it all crashing down. But there is no satisfaction. He thought this moment would bring relief, that this would be the end of the road, but all he sees is the beginning. The system hasn't changed. The people Randall left behind are still in their positions. Those who covered up his crimes are still sitting in offices, untouched.